thanks to the American Council on Germany for organising this, and for the Goethe-Institut and Christoph for hosting us. In case it wasn't entirely clear from the introduction, I should probably say at the beginning that I'm British, and what you're going to get from me is I think, quite a British view on Germany. I do now live in Berlin, as Mark mentioned, but this is going to be somewhat of an outsider's view on Germany. What I'd like to do is talk about how Germany's role in Europe has changed in the 25 years since reunification, or almost to the day. Tomorrow is the anniversary. And to talk also about how Germany's pre-1945 history might be relevant to the current situation in Europe. And then finally to say something about what what this story I'm going to tell and about Germany's role in Europe means for the United States and for transatlantic relations. I want to start by going all the way back in German history, not to reunification, but to unification in 1871, and the original German question. The essence of the German question after 1871 was that Germany was too powerful for a balance of power in Europe, but too small for hegemony. In other words, too powerful in military terms for any of the great powers, the other four great powers in Europe at that time, to challenge, but not powerful enough to defeat a coalition of two or more of them. Now, this was an inherently problematic position. Ludwig Dehiel, the German historian, described Germany's position in Europe as one of semi-hegemony rather than hegemony. So it's a kind of an in-between position. And it was inherently problematic because it encouraged other European powers to form coalitions to balance against German power. And that in turn created a fear in Germany of encirclement. Einkreisung is the German term. Bismarck famously had what he called Cauchemar der Coalition, a nightmare of coalitions. And this is a paradigmatic case, really, of what international relations theorists call the security dilemma, whereby one state takes measures to enhance its own security, but in doing so threatens the security of another state or other states, which in turn then take countermeasures, and so a kind of a spiral develops, which ultimately can lead to war. And so there began what another German historian, Hans-Peter Schwarz, called a dialectic of encirclement, which culminated in World War I. Now, after the end of World War II, the German question seemed to have been resolved by the division of Germany and the integration of the western half of Germany, at least, the Federal Republic, into the West in the form of NATO and what became the European Union. After the fall of the wall in 1989 and the likelihood of German reunification very soon after that, the German question re-emerged. As Christoph mentioned, there were fears about the power of this new enlarged Germany at the centre of Europe, particularly in France and in the UK. The French approach, which President Mitterrand took, was essentially a continuation of French post-war foreign policy, which was to try to constrain German power through European integration. In this case, by going even further than Europe had gone before, and in particular to create economic and monetary union, in other words, the single currency, the euro. It wasn't a new idea. It had been talked about going back to the 1970s, and even before the fall of the wall, Mitterrand was in favour of a single currency. Without a common currency, he said, we are all subordinate to the Germans' will. But after the fall of the war, there was a new urgency to this project of the single currency. And Mitterrand demanded from Helmut Kohl that a timetable was set for negotiations about a single currency, about economic and monetary union, before the end of 1990. Otherwise, as he put it, we will return to the world of 1913, in other words, the classical German question. And Kohl succumbed to that French pressure, and an agreement was reached in December 1989 to hold an intergovernmental conference by the end of 1990, which was the key breakthrough in what became the single currency. And so it seemed that the German question had once again been resolved, and in a way that seemed to confirm the symbiotic relationship between Germany and Europe. Konrad Adenauer had famously said that German problems can only be solved under a European roof, and Kohl had continued this line of thinking when he talked about the way that European integration and German reunification were two sides of the same coin. Subsequently, the enlargement of the European Union and of NATO in the 1990s meant that Germany was surrounded on all sides by allies and partners. Volker Ruhr, the German defense minister, famously said that Germany was now encircled by friends. In other words, from having the classical German question of the 19th century to be encircled by enemies, it was now encircled by friends. And so in geopolitical terms, Germany was and is, I would argue, benign. There's no danger of war in Europe. But, and this is the argument that I make in the book, which Mark mentioned, The Paradox of German Power, it is, I think, now clear, 25 years later, that the single currency amplified German power rather than constraining it. And the way that this happened, I think, is quite complex, and I'm not going to spend too much time going into the detail of it now, but essentially in the 1990s, the costs of reunification, I think, masked to some extent the transformation of the power relations within Europe, in particular the balance between France and Germany that had existed up to that point. But from the sort of mid-2000s onwards, it became clear that the transformation of the German economy that began when Gerhard Schröder was Chancellor between 1998 and 2005 had, on the one hand, led to a recovery of the German economy, which had been struggling in the era of Schröder. German manufacturing became much more competitive. In particular, I would argue, not so much through the measures that Schröder himself took, but through the way that German manufacturers started to outsource production to the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, Hungary and Slovakia and so on. German automobile industry is a very good example of this, which on the one hand made them more competitive, at the same time put downward pressure on wages within Germany. So even the jobs that remained within Germany, the unions agreed to remarkable wage restraint because of the possibility of outsourcing. And so as a consequence of this, Germany, which it went from having a current account deficit briefly to having a current account surplus, which has persisted and grown since then. The latest figures suggest that the German current account surplus might reach 10% quite soon, which is extraordinarily high, especially for an economy the size of Germany's. And this current account surplus puts, I would argue, intolerable pressure on other countries in the Eurozone, and in particular on the countries that we now call, since the Euro crisis began, the periphery. So the size of Germany's economy and the interdependence between it and that of its neighbours is now creating instability, it seems to me, in a somewhat analogous way to the way that German military power once did. And thus the German question, which Europe seemed to have put behind it, has now re-emerged, but not in geopolitical form, but in geoeconomic form. The concept of geoeconomics goes back to Edward Luttwak, who wrote this essay in 1990, where he talked about the way that in the sort of post-Cold War world, economic means would increasingly displace military means, but that international relations would follow the same kind of zero-sum logic as it had in the past. It's quite a dark vision of international relations. And so I think this is what has led us to this situation that we now have, and the debate that's taken place in the last 5 years since the euro crisis began about a German euro. In 1953, Thomas Mann famously called for a European Germany rather than a German euro. But since the crisis began, it's become almost a commonplace to talk about a German Europe emerging from the crisis. And I think that in one sense this is correct. There is a German Europe, and in another sense I think it's misleading to talk about a German Europe. It's correct in the sense that Germany's increased power, and it should be said France's relative weakness, has allowed, it means that Germany is clearly the most powerful country in the EU, and it's allowed Germany to a large extent to impose its preferences on other countries within the Eurozone. In a way, I think the story of the last 5 years has been an attempt by Germany to kind of remake Germany, particularly in economic terms, but also in social, political terms, in its own image. However, Germany is too small, it seems to me, not powerful enough to be a European hegemon. Lots of people have described Germany as a hegemon in Europe. Some people have suggested that it is not yet one because of a kind of a mental block, a kind of a reluctance that Germany has. There's been this phrase, a reluctant hegemon, that's been used a lot, but that Germany has the ability to be a hegemon if it could overcome this mental block, if it were bolder and accepted this leadership role. But I disagree. I don't think Germany has the ability to be a hegemon. It's not big enough, it's not powerful enough. What it would mean, I think, to be a hegemon in the context of the euro crisis would be to accept much greater fiscal transfers within the Eurozone, to accept a mutualisation of European debt, to accept moderate inflation, to become a consumer of last resource. I mean, there's a whole series of things which hegemons do. The paradigmatic case would be the US, actually, after World War II, that Germany actually doesn't want to do, and I would argue is not actually capable of doing. It actually overstretches Germany's economic resources to do these types of things. And so it seems to me that Germany is once again in this position, this in-between position, strikingly similar to the one that it had in Europe between 1871 and 1945. In other words, it seems to have returned to this position of semi-hegemony, halb-hegemony, that Ludwig Dehio talked about, except in geo-economic rather than in geopolitical form. And in this sense, it seems to me that what is emerging from the crisis is not so much a German Europe as a chaotic Europe. And I think the best illustration of that is the migration crisis, which perhaps we can come back to afterwards in the discussion. So what does this new German role in Europe, which I, in the book, call the geo-economic semi-hegemony, what does it mean for relations with the United States and the future of the transatlantic relationship? It seems to me that it has three consequences for the type of partner that Europe is going to be able to be for the United States for the foreseeable future. The first is that this chaotic nature of Europe means that Europe is going to be inward-looking for the foreseeable future, preoccupied with its own problems. 5 years after the Greek crisis began, it remains unresolved, and Greece, it's worth stressing, represents 2% of the Eurozone's GDP. This is a manageable crisis, and 5 years later, not only has it not been resolved, but actually we're having really, I think, the same discussion that we were having 5 years ago. We really haven't moved on very far at all in solving the problem. The danger of a Grexit, in other words, Greece leaving the Eurozone or being kicked out of the Eurozone, hasn't gone away. In fact, I think that it'll probably come back within the next few months. But it's not just about Greece. Actually, what's happened over the last 5 years is the Greek crisis turned into essentially an existential crisis for the EU, not even just for the Eurozone, but for the EU. And one element of that is the debate that's now taking place in Britain, my country, about whether to leave the EU altogether, which would potentially be catastrophic, I think, for the EU. So there are a whole series of economic, institutional questions, even if Britain does stay within the EU. There's a very important discussion about how a country like Britain, which won't join the single currency, how it can essentially defend its own interests from what I see as a third tier of the sort of three-tier Europe that's emerging. Very, very complicated kind of institutional questions arising out of that, which is going to keep Europe busy for the next 5 years or so. And so I think we're going to have a very inward-looking Europe. The second thing has to do with the nature of German power, what I, in the book, call the paradox of German power. Because Germany is quite unique in the mixture of, on the one hand, economic assertiveness that it displays, and on the other hand, military abstinence. This disconnect between economic power and military power is quite unique, I think, to Germany. This, I think, can be seen most clearly in the Ukraine crisis, where on the one hand, Germany has taken quite a tough approach in terms of imposing economic sanctions on Russia in response to the annexation of Crimea and the destabilization of eastern Ukraine. There, Merkel, I think, has played a very constructive role and has persuaded other EU member states like Italy that were even more reluctant to impose sanctions to go along with the sanctions. But on the other hand, Germany has essentially blocked a whole series of steps using military tools. So, for example, there was a demand from Poland and the Baltic states to have a permanent NATO presence in their countries in order to deter Russia. And that was blocked by Merkel. And so there's this extreme reluctance, not just to deploy military force, but to use military tools in order to shape international relations. And so, for example, even after the Ukraine crisis, which was a real strategic shock for Germany, German defence spending remains at around 1.3% of GDP, and there's no indication that this is going to increase very much. NATO member states make a commitment to spend 2% of GDP on defence, and this has long been a source of transatlantic friction. Germany's been criticised by the US, but also by other NATO countries like the UK that have spent more on defence than Germany has. The former US Defence Secretary, Robert Gates, talked about the danger of a two-tiered alliance, divided between, quote, those willing and able to pay the price and bear the burdens of alliance commitment, and on the other hand, quote, those who enjoy the benefits of NATO but don't want to share the risks and costs. In other words, the accusation is that Germany is free-riding, essentially, and it's a consumer of security rather than a provider of security. This, it seems to me, could continue to be a source of transatlantic friction, particularly, I think, because the US is now trying to pivot towards Asia and wants Europe, as a complement to that, to take much more responsibility for security in its own neighbourhood. Not just in the east in relation to Russia and Ukraine and so on, but also in the southern neighbourhood. Obviously, there's the Syria crisis and several other parts of a kind of a region of instability that is a huge challenge for Europe. And part of the reason that Europe is struggling to deal with that is because of Germany's reluctance to spend money on defence, to develop military capabilities and to deploy them if necessary. The third consequence, I think, is to do with the nature of the German economy. The transformation of the German economy in the 2000s that I described earlier on the one hand, led to this recovery, particularly of exporters, who have now, in the last sort of decade or so, really boomed. But the flip side of that was the domestic demand remained very low, continues to remain very low. And as a consequence of that, the German economy has become much more dependent over time on exports. The German economy was always an export-driven economy, but if you look over the last decade or so, from the year 2000 to the year 2010, the contribution of exports to German GDP went from about a third, 33%, to nearly 50%, which is, again, an extraordinary high figure for an economy the size of Germany. And I would argue makes Germany very vulnerable, as it's now discovering as demand slows in China. What essentially happened was that Germany benefited from demand partly from within the Eurozone, the countries of the so-called periphery. And then when that slowed after the Euro crisis began, the German economy shifted even more towards emerging economies, and above all to China. And now demand is starting apparently to slow there as well. And that brings me to the reason this could cause transatlantic, this could be a source of transatlantic friction, because the German economy is becoming increasingly dependent on non-Western powers, but above all on China as a source of demand. China is now the second biggest export market for Germany outside of the EU after the US, and is set to overtake the US fairly soon. And if you look at the figures for individual companies, some of them are quite extraordinary. Volkswagen, for example, which obviously is in the news at the moment, and we might come on to talk about that in the discussion afterwards. I read a figure recently which said that 62% of Volkswagen's net profit now comes from China, which is quite extraordinary dependence, I think, on China. That brings me to my final point, which is about Germany's relationship with the West. Because Germany always had a rather complex relationship with the West. On the one hand, many of the ideas that were central to what the historian Heinrich August Winkler has called the normative project of the West came from German Enlightenment thinkers like Immanuel Kant. But on the other hand, German intellectual history also had this darker current of nationalism that first emerged in the early 19th century. And especially after 1848, after the failure of the revolution of 1848, defined German identity against the principles of the French Revolution and more broadly against the principles of the Enlightenment. And this nationalist current obviously culminated in Nazism, which Winkler calls the climax of the German rejection of the Western world. So there's this anti-Western current within German intellectual history as well. And so Germany was a paradox even then. On the one hand, it played a central role in constituting the idea of the West. On the other hand, it also produced the most radical challenge to the West from within. It was only after the catastrophe of 1945 that Germany, or at least the western half of Germany, was integrated into the West. And during the Cold War, what became known as the Westbindung, in other words, the integration of the Federal Republic into the West, was a kind of an existential necessity because of the threat from the Soviet Union. What I think is very interesting about the moment that we're currently in, particularly against the background of some of the trends that I've been describing, increasing economic dependence on countries like China, is that strategic imperative has now disappeared. And for the first time, the Westbindung is a choice. And that means, I think, it is now possible for the first time to imagine, at least, a post-Western German foreign policy.